On April 16, 1968, the Arellano family piled into their blue and white Buick in Piedras Negras, Mexico. Excuse my pronunciation, I'm really bad at Spanish. And they headed to San Angelo, Texas, where Manuel Arellano Sr.'s sister was about to give birth. Manuel Sr. had made the 200-mile drive along the desolate southwest Texas highways many times, so he didn't expect any major obstacles. The Arellano family never made it to San Angelo, however. They had car trouble, and some friendly locals helped them out. But the next morning, the bodies of 5 of the Arellano family members were found scattered along US 277. Only 5-year-old Manuel Jr. survived. Almost 57 years after the fact, this horrifying mass murder remains one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in Texas history. And the Arellanos case sits in a box in the basement. Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In the last 50 years, the U.S. has had nearly 1 million homicides, and since then, over 250,000 cases sit in a box in a basement where all hopes for justice go to die. In 1996, someone shot my uncle Leon Laurelis, changing my life forever and leaving a devastating hole in my heart, and his case remains unsolved. Join me and my wife, Leah, as we shed light on these forgotten victims, their life, the loved ones they left behind, the evidence, and the theories of who committed these crimes, leaving communities in fear and leaving families without answers. Support our effort to change the justice system through the Homicide Families Victims' Rights Act, as we hope to make a difference with our audience as we remember the victims and demand justice. In 1996, my world was shattered when my uncle Leon Laurelis was shot execution-style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and coworkers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting collecting dust in a box in a basement. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement Podcast and Justice for Leon Laurelis. And now you can also find us on YouTube.
The National Archives describes 1968 as, quote, a year of turmoil and change, end quote. But that's a major understatement if I've ever seen one. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy Sr. were assassinated. The Tet Offensive took place in Vietnam, and the death toll in that war reached a record high. The Prague Spring, or the political liberalization of Czechoslovakia, was crushed by the Warsaw Pact invasion, and 1968 is generally considered the start of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. With those social and political shifts came some interesting pop culture and artistic trends. Mainstream music became a strident political voice, with rock and folk artists protesting war and violence abroad, and country artists protesting the establishment at home. 1968 is when Johnny Cash took his live show to Folsom Prison. Many Americans embraced and boosted black artists as the tides of the civil rights movement finally turned, and science fiction was prominently featured in cinema, television, and literature. Think Star Trek and Planet of the Apes. The week of April 16, 1968, Honey by Bobby Goldsboro was number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, though the Beatles' Hey Jude would be the top-selling single of the year. You Are My Treasure by Jack Green topped the country charts. The Graduate, starring Dustin Hoffman, was number 1 at the box office that week, and Arthur Haley's Airport topped the New York Times bestseller list. Because this crime didn't really happen in or even near a town, we'll talk a little bit about the family's intended route and the county and area in general. Arellano family was living in a small town in Mexico just across the border from Eagle Pass, Texas. As we mentioned earlier, the drive to San Angelo was just over 200 miles, and in a 10-year-old Buick in 1968, it probably would have taken a minimum of 5 hours. There were several young kids in the car, so if you factor in bathroom breaks and meltdowns, maybe even a little longer. Manuel Sr., who was driving the car, would have crossed into the U.S. at Eagle Pass, then taken U.S. Highway 277, which roughly follows the Texas-Mexico border to Del Rio, where it turns north to San Angelo. It's a fairly straight shot. This crime occurred in rural Edwards County, which isn't saying much because most of Edwards County is rural. The family was about 100 miles south of San Angelo, 32 miles south of Sonora, right outside the entrance to the W.L. Bud Whitehead Ranch. So pretty much in the middle of nowhere and halfway to their destination. Edwards County is one of the least densely populated in the state, number 248 out of 254 counties in Texas. Today, less than 1,400 people live there, though in 1968, that number would have been slightly higher, closer to 2,100 people. Not much goes on in Edwards County. Today, the economy is driven by tourism, with the Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area located there and copious hunting opportunities in the area. Agriculture used to have a much larger share of the local economy, with mohair being the primary focus, but it's declined significantly over the last few decades. The Whitehead Ranch I mentioned a minute ago was and still is a cattle operation.
The 6 family members traveling to San Angelo on that fateful day in April 1968 were 29-year-old Manuel Arellano Sr., his 24-year-old wife, Monica, their 3 children, Manuel Jr., age 5, Leticia, 2.5, Eduardo, 15 months, and Manuel Sr.'s sister Rosa, who was 21 at the time. Manuel Arellano Sr. was born on November 13, 1938, in Kermit, Texas. Though he lived in Mexico at the time of his death, he'd spent a significant amount of time in the U.S. as a farm worker and in meat processing facilities, and had family in Texas, including his sister Monica, who was about to have a baby in San Angelo. Manuel Sr. had a brother-in-law who was running for sheriff in Zavala County, which isn't very far from where the Arellanos lived in Mexico. Manuel's wife, Monica Lopez Arellano, was born May 5, 1943, in Mexico. And Manuel Sr.'s sister, Rosa, was born in Mexico in 1946. The two Arellano children who died were born in the United States. Leticia was born in Michigan, and Eduardo was born in Eagle Pass, Texas. Like I mentioned in the intro, the family was traveling to San Angelo, Texas, because one of Manuel Sr.'s sisters was having a baby. The 6 members of the Arellano family crammed into Manuel Sr.'s 1958 Buick Special and headed out. This isn't a terrible drive, not too long, and it's a pretty straight shot from point A to point B. It's just in one of those most desolate parts of the state. If you run into trouble, it will be terribly inconvenient. Even today, it isn't a good spot to break down. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened here. The Buick blew a tire out about 40 miles north of the Mexico border on Highway 277. Manuel Sr. carried a spare, which he swapped out fairly quickly and easily, and the family carried on. About 5 miles down the road, approximately 30 miles south of Sonora, Texas, the Buick had another blowout. Now they were stuck, since they'd already used the spare tire. This was 1968, so there were no cell phones, obviously. Since this was so far out in the middle of nowhere, there was really no chance of Manuel Sr. hoofing it to a payphone or a gas station. So the family sat and waited for another car to pass by, hoping that person would be kind enough to take Manuel Sr. somewhere he could get help. A man named J.T. Quigg and a couple of his coworkers on a road crew saw the Buick, stopped, and asked if the family needed help. Unfortunately, the road crew didn't have the right equipment to help, and they went on their way. Another man stopped later on, and Manuel and his family got in this Good Samaritan's truck with the Buick's flat tire, and they all headed off to Sonora. Manuel Sr. took the tire to an auto repair shop to get fixed at around 8:45 p.m., and he and his oldest son then walked to a local restaurant to get some dinner. Manuel Sr. paid for the tire in cash, and then the Good Samaritan packed everyone back into his truck for the return trip to the Buick. That was around 10 p.m.
The next morning, Wednesday, April 17th, J.T. Quigg passed the Arellanos' Buick again on his way to work and noticed the car was empty. He got a squicky feeling, so he went to the ranch. Remember, the car was originally stopped right near the main entrance to the Whitehead Ranch, and the owner, Bud Whitehead, told him a harrowing story. One of the ranch hands was out near the front entrance earlier that morning, and he saw blood smeared on the gate. He then followed a trail of blood until he found Manuel Sr.'s body in a pasture. The ranch hand, Bud Whitehead, and T.J. Quigg all rode out to Manuel Sr.'s body and had a better look around. He'd been beaten severely, shot, and his pants pockets were turned inside out, as if he'd been robbed. 3 of the children, baby Eduardo, Leticia, and Manuel Jr. were found nearby. Eduardo was found face down in a ditch. He had been beaten and stabbed in the back multiple times. 2.5-year-old Leticia and 5-year-old Manuel Jr. were both shot and stabbed multiple times as well. Shockingly, though they'd both been shot in the head, Leticia and Manuel Jr. were still alive. The three men tended to the children as best they could for what must have been an absolutely agonizing 40 minutes until first responders got to the scene. The two older children were rushed to the hospital, but Leticia was too gravely injured and died 2 days later. Manuel Jr. was airlifted to San Antonio, and miraculously, he survived the attack. Monica and Rosa were found about 3 miles from the others, and the Buick had been moved. Monica was in a ditch, and Rosa was under some brush a few feet away, her clothes stripped from her body. Monica had been shot and stabbed, and Rosa had been sexually assaulted and then stabbed.
Investigators hit a brick wall almost immediately. They collected fingerprints from the Buick and recovered a .22 caliber bullet from one of the victims and sent those items to DPS headquarters in Austin, Texas. But other than that, they had very little to go on. No gun was found, no knife was found, and the object used to inflict the beatings on the victims wasn't found either. This was a long, desolate stretch of highway, so there were no witnesses to the crime, at least none that have ever come forward. When Manuel Jr. was well enough, about 2 weeks after the attack, police asked to interview him, and the story he told was chilling. He spoke in Spanish, and being 5 years old, couldn't read or write much in any language, so he spoke through a translator. He said that the man who killed his entire family was the Good Samaritan who had given them a ride into Sonora and then back to their vehicle. He was described as quote unquote big cowboy, sandy blonde hair, tall, and wearing cowboy boots with his pants tucked into them and a hat. The boots also had some kind of tooling or other decorative aspect to them as well. The little boy said the big cowboy started shooting his gun out of the truck window on the way back to the Buick. Manuel Sr. asked the man to stop, and a fight ensued, which then turned into a massacre. Other witnesses in town were able to corroborate some of this. People in town, including the mechanic who repaired the Buick's tire, David Lorden, described the man accompanying the family as 30 to 35 years old, tall, with sandy blonde hair, and wearing boots with some kind of design on the toes and a hat, and had a skinning knife hanging from his belt. At the same time, some parts of Manuel Jr.'s story didn't make sense. He didn't understand some of the questions being asked, and the answers he gave were strange. This can be attributed to a number of factors. First of all, he was speaking Spanish and using a translator, and things get misunderstood and miscommunicated. Second, he was 5 years old, and it's difficult to get clear answers from any 5-year-old, let alone one who had been traumatized so severely. Kids that age have a hard time with nuance and timelines, and they don't have the vocabulary of critical thinking skills to communicate events in ways adults can understand. I remember my granddaughters would say it's 1 o'clock, no matter what time it was, because they didn't understand time when they were little. Lastly, he'd suffered a serious head injury, which caused investigators to question his retelling of events. Plus, one of the gunshots had damaged the nerves in his ear, and he suffered major hearing loss as a result. Manuel Jr. later identified a man in a police photo lineup he said was the perpetrator, and the cops distributed that photograph around the state.
Fort Worth police officer Ken Adcock made a routine traffic stop on May 13, 1968, and found the two individuals in the car he had stopped very suspicious. The driver had a suspended driver's license, and he fit the description of the suspect in the Edwards County Massacre. He was 6 feet tall, and his hair had been recently and very obviously dyed black. The passenger in the car was carrying a .22 caliber weapon and was wearing boots matching witness descriptions in Sonora. Adcock also found several hundred Mexican pesos, a wallet with a Mexican ID, though it's unclear whose ID it was, an unused bus ticket from Waco to Laredo, and a baggage stub that indicated luggage had been checked at Waco and retrieved in Laredo. The men were taken to the Tarrant County Jail, but David Lorden, the man who'd fixed the Arellanos tire, was unable to pick them out of a lineup, so they were released. For the next 5 months, local police and the Texas Rangers tracked down every lead they had and conducted countless interviews. At that point, law enforcement released some information and appealed to the general public for help. The case took a bit of a wild turn when investigators attempted to track down David Lorden for more information and found out he'd been arrested for passing bad checks and was sitting in the Sonora County Jail. Lorden and an accomplice stole a guard's rifle and escaped from jail in February of 1969, and he made it as far as San Francisco before getting caught and extradited back to Texas. After that, the case went cold. Investigators at the time were operating under the theory that this was a robbery, given that Manuel Sr.'s pockets had been emptied, and that more than likely only one person was involved. We'll get into that a little more in depth later. It's just worth mentioning that early in the investigation, it was assumed the perpetrator acted alone, and that robbery was the motive.
Interest in the case was renewed in 1999 when an anonymous tipster called DPS and said they knew who committed the murders. Nothing came of that tip, but investigators started digging into the case again. This was over 30 years later, so the fresh perspective and new technology might do some good. The Texas Ranger handling the case at the time, Sergeant Brooks Long, dove headfirst into the investigation. He tracked down the ranch hand who found the bodies, but he had nothing new to report. He tried to find the Arellano family's 1958 Buick, but gave up after 2 years of scourging salvage yards all over Texas. He traveled all around the state conducting interviews and even went to Mexico to interview Manuel Jr., who was in his late 40s, married with children, and had a successful career in finance. Sergeant Long resubmitted physical evidence for testing. Some of the technology available, like DNA testing, wasn't even a fantasy in 1968. A man in California had been arrested for a very similar crime, so DNA was tested against that man. While a single DNA profile was developed during testing, it didn't match the killer in California, however, and the investigation ground to a halt once again. Sergeant Long did develop a new theory, however. He believed that there was no way this kind of massacre could have been carried out by a single person. The Edwards County Sheriff's Department is now handling the case, and their investigators apparently tested the DNA against another person of interest still living near Sonora. But that test came back inconclusive.
So, who killed the Arellano family in April of 1968?
Interviews with other family members indicated that Manuel Sr. didn't have any enemies. He was a decent guy, Friendly, a hard worker, doting father, good husband. That combined with the circumstances of the killings means we can probably eliminate the possibility that this was carried out by someone the family knew. Maybe not completely, but it seems highly unlikely.
So, in my mind, anyway, we're looking at two real options here. First, it was the quote unquote big cowboy and probably an accomplice who did this. Or it's another person or multiple people who happened across the Arellanos while they were stuck on the side of the road. We do know that while this occurred in a remote location, at least one more person passed the Arellanos. That would be the road construction worker J.T. Quigg, who helped find the bodies the morning after the attack. When I first started researching the case, I was like, oh, it was totally the big cowboy. There's no other explanation that makes sense. Then I started to take a look at some of the smaller details and realized it is possible that this person, the big cowboy, wasn't responsible. My intuition tells me it was him and probably a second person with him, but there are other possibilities that deserve scrutiny.
Right. First off, it was 10 p.m. While it's not impossible to believe that another car may have driven by on 277 moments after being dropped off, it seems unlikely at that hour. It would have been pitch black out on that stretch of road. Unless Manuel Sr. did in fact flag down another vehicle for assistance, and that's when things went sideways. One thing I wondered as I was reading through the source material was that if the patch tire was ever put back on the vehicle. I couldn't get a straight yes or no answer, but the article in the LA Times said, quote, the car was found about 8 miles south of the bodies, still with a flat tire, end quote. So that tells me two things. First, someone moved the car. The fact that it was moved south, which was the direction the family came from, makes me think it wasn't one of the adults who did it. Although it's possible the family decided to turn around and head back home, but it's hard to say. The place they got the second flat was roughly halfway between home and San Angelo, so that is something to consider. Maybe they felt more comfortable heading back home instead of pushing on. And the reason I bring that up is because, as the LA Times article mentioned, the car had another flat tire. From the context, I'm assuming it was the tire that had been taken to the shop in Sonora to get patched. Perhaps Dave Lorden did shoddy work and the tire blew again as the family headed back to Mexico. They pulled over and then someone else stopped and killed them all. The major problem with that theory is obviously explaining how the bodies ended up 5 and 8 miles north. Maybe the family remembered the entrance to the Whitehead Ranch and decided to walk there to get help. They came across a bad actor who murdered them all on the way to getting help. Walking 8 miles with a toddler and a baby in the dark would be difficult, to say the least. An adult could make that walk in 3 hours, but I'm not so sure about the kids.
Yeah, at that point, just hunker down in the car and wait for the morning. Someone will come along the road eventually, and if you did have to walk, it would be much safer and easier to do so in the daylight. Between the rocks and uneven pavement and critters, there's no way in hell I'd walk that in the daylight, let alone in the dark. So, funny story, the very first time Arlene and I heard about this story was on another podcast. I can't remember which one, but we were driving back from Vegas, which is a whole other ridiculous story in and of itself. We were actually on US Highway 277 when the episode started. We were north of Sonora, not south, but still. It was one of those moments that kind of made your skin crawl. But I remember the road, and I remember thinking how god awful it would be to break down out there. And that was in like 2022 with cell phones and GPS, not 1968. While I don't think I can dismiss the possibility of something like the scenario you laid out entirely, I'm with you. I think it's less likely than a scenario where the big cowboy and his henchmen, if he had one, committed the murders.
It's just the scenario that makes the most sense, especially when you consider the statements given by Manuel Jr. Yes, he was only 5 at the time, but that seems like a pretty wild story for a kid to make up out of thin air. He rode in the big cowboy's truck to Sonora and back. He said the man started shooting at rabbits and deer. His dad confronted the man. They got into a fight, and then the killings started. He probably took out Manuel Sr. first, especially if he did this alone, since he would have likely been the biggest and strongest of the family members. Then the kids, then the women. The one sticky thing with this particular theory is, why were the women found several miles away? If it was just one perpetrator, why not just kill everyone there? That's the detail that makes me think there were at least 2 people involved. One person went for Manuel Sr. and the kids, and the other one shoved the women back into the Buick and drove south. He killed the women, then continued south until the patch tire blew out again, where he abandoned the car.
Right. There are 100 different scenarios I can come up with that would explain the positions of the bodies in relation to the car, but we don't really have time to discuss every single one of them. The point is that the separation of the bodies and the position of the car make me think that more than one person is involved. Some may disagree, and that's okay. It's a crazy-ass scene with a lot of variables and moving parts. But that's essentially where we are today. If you have any information about the murder of the Arellano family on April 16, 1968, on U.S. Highway 277 south of Sonora, please contact the Edwards County Sheriff's Office at 830-683-4104.
Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. If you or someone you know is a victim of crime, support is available. Call 855-4-VICTIM to speak with someone who can help you understand your rights and options. Visit victimconnect.org to learn more. We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network. Darkcast Network, the best in indie podcasts. Check out all the great shows at darkcastnetwork.com. If you think bringing unsolved cases is important, then please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. Also, please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcasts and Justice for Leon Laurelis. You can now also find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor and subscribe. It would help so much, my lovelies. Also, please share this episode so we can bring awareness to these lesser-known cases so we can reach more people in hopes that someone who may know something will come forward. I'd also like to ask that you sign my petition for my Uncle Leon Laurelis' case to be reopened and reviewed with fresh eyes. And you can find our petition on change.org. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators.